Afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited that we were finally able to get the kinks out and we're able to get the program going. And thanks for joining us today. This should be an outstanding program. We're incredibly fortunate to be able to have this conversation with Yossi Klein Halevi. Yossi, I'm a big fan. So my name is Ephraim Seidman. I'm chair of the Israel Education and Advocacy Subcommittee of the Jewish Community Relations Committee. The JCRC is the public relations and advocacy arm of the Jewish Community Federation of Richmond. Founded in 1935, the Jewish Community Federation of Richmond represents almost 15,000 Jewish constituents in Greater Richmond and Central Virginia region. This afternoon's program is part of a speaker series exploring the rise of global anti-Semitism. Today's program will look at the topic through the lens of Zionism and where anti-Israel statements and actions possibly cross over into anti-Semitism. I'd like to thank our corporate sponsors. Without their support, we couldn't do what we do. So a big shout out and thank you to Allianz, Secours, Salomon and Ludwin, and Dominion Payroll. And thanks also to our community partners, Weinstein JCC, Virginia Holocaust Museum, Jewish Family Services, Congregation Atid, Congregation Ami, Keneseth Beth Israel, Temple Bethel, American Jewish Committee, Washington, D.C., and the Anti-Defamation League, Washington, D.C. I want to remind you that you can ask your questions at any time in the Q&A tab below. And I also want to mention that we were planning to go a little bit over to about 3:15. That still might be our cutoff time. Hang around till the end, please. I can assure you it'll be worth it. Today's conversation will, of course, be in the capable hands of David Cohen. David is director of our Richmond JCRC. And as I like to remind everyone, he's our one and only professional JCRC staff member. We're incredibly fortunate to have David at the helm of JCRC and with the leadership of our volunteer chair, Amy Melnick-Scharf, and the other fabulous committee chairs. Richmond JCRC, in my humble opinion, punches way above our weight. So thank you, David, for everything you do for our community. And now to the main event. So I'm a liberal Zionist, and I've admired Yossi Klein Halevi for years, for his intellect, for his courage, for his outreach to his neighbors, and for his vision of a peace that has eluded Israel since its rebirth. Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem and a non-resident fellow of the Trends think tank in Abu Dhabi. Now, if you aren't familiar with the Shalom Hartman Institute, I strongly suggest you check it out on the web. They do fabulous programming. At the Hartman Institute, Yossi co-directs the Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. Over 100 Muslim leaders have participated in this unique program. His 2013 book, Like Dreamers, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year Award. And his latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is a New York Times bestseller. Now make sure you get the paperback edition so you get to see the replies that Yossi received from Arab readers from all over the world. Interesting read. Yossi also writes for leading op-ed pages in North America, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, and he's a former contributing editor to the New Republic. He is frequently quoted on Israeli, Middle Eastern, and Jewish affairs in leading media around the world, and is one of the best-known lecturers on Israeli issues in American Jewish community and on North American campuses. He is the recipient of the 2019 Figure of Reconciliation Award of the Polish Council of Christians and Jews. Born in Brooklyn, Yossi received his BA in Jewish Studies from Brooklyn College and his MS in Journalism from Northwestern University. Yossi lives in Jerusalem, moved there in 1982, lives with his wife, Sarah, and who helps direct a Center for Jewish Meditation. They have 3 children. So it's my sincere honor to introduce Yossi Klein Halevi. David, Yossi, take it away.
Thank you very much, Ephraim. And again, just to echo what we say a lot on these calls, and I'm sure you know this, Yossi, we cannot do the work that we do without amazing volunteers like Ephraim, like everyone that works on the JCRC, and especially the Israel Advocacy and Education Committee that helps push this agenda forward. So thank you, Ephraim. Thank you, Yossi, for joining us and for, I think, what will be a great conversation. So
thank you for having me. Wonderful to be with you.
Absolutely. And again, apologies for the delay. So let's, without further ado, let's get right into it. As Ephraim said, one of the reasons we wanted to have you on this call was how well you articulate, in a sense, the title of, or the topic of our conversation, which is the meaning of Zionism. And I think the way, we had a conversation about how to approach today, and it was about this idea of the importance, the significance of Israel that I think you write so well about. And I think that's where I'd like to start. Can you take us there a little bit from your perspective? And I think some questions we posed to get there were, why does Israel matter? Why does it still matter? Why don't we start there?
So my starting point is the year 1945. 1945 is ground zero of modern Jewish history. If you go back to 1945, you look at what the Jewish map is like, what Jewish reality is like in the year 1945, you see a people that is shattered, that isn't sure what its future is, that has just experienced its worst blow in history. And then you look around the world. You see, first of all, the survivors are living in displaced persons camps. Nobody wants them. There's no place for them. In the Middle East, which has intact Jewish communities, 1 million Jews living in ancient diasporas, the atmosphere there is of impending disaster. They are under relentless physical assault, which partly is a response to Zionism, but is also partly a response to the coming collapse of the colonialist order. And if you look at the fate of minorities in the Middle East today, you can imagine what would have happened to 1 million plus Jews if they had stayed in countries like Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Lebanon. A catastrophe. Continue the survey, go to the Soviet Union. 3.5 million Jews are imprisoned behind the Iron Curtain, are being forcibly assimilated, denied their most minimal ability to maintain and continue their Jewish identity. So the Jewish world, outside of the major Jewish community in the United States and the Yishuv, the Jewish community in the land of Israel, the rest of the Jewish world is disintegrating. And in 1945, an alliance is formed between the Jewish community of the land of Israel, the Yishuv, and American Jewry. American Jewry becomes fully Zionized in 1945. Until the Holocaust, American Jews have been very divided. In 1945, this alliance is formed to save world Jewry. And then now, if you fast forward 73 years later, we're about to celebrate the 73rd anniversary, you'll see that this alliance between Israel, the Zionist movement, and American Jewry saved world Jewry. And the major waves of Israeli immigration were actually these three endangered communities. The first were the DP camps, survivors, who came in 1948. The next major wave were the Jews of Arab countries. And the final wave that came in the early 1990s were the Jews of the former Soviet Union. And so when I think about Israel, my starting point is 1945 and a sense of enormous gratitude for Israel's essential role in saving the Jewish people. And that was a rescue mission that could only have succeeded with this alliance between Israel and American Jewry. And so when we look at the relationship today between Israel and American Jews, and we know that relationship is going through a crisis, we need to first of all remind ourselves about how essential that relationship has been in quite literally saving the Jewish people. And for me, what this really is about is gratitude. And it's a very simple, basic, but essential emotion. When I think of Israel, I feel overwhelming gratitude. If not for Israel, much of the Jewish world would have collapsed. And I think, quite honestly, American Jewry might have lost its nerve, its self-confidence. And so I think that the Jewish people would have been in a state of fatal decline if the state of Israel hadn't emerged. And it isn't only about the Holocaust, it's also about Soviet Jewry, it's also about Ethiopian Jewry, it's also about the major diasporas of the Middle East. And I think that Israel has had a major psychological impact on the self-confidence of American Jewry. So if that's all Israel did, then for me, that's a Dayenu moment. No, that's it, Dayenu. But Israel actually has done a lot more than that. It is now the largest Jewish community in the world, and it is well on its way to becoming the home of the absolute majority of world Jewry, which is astonishing. I moved to Israel in 1982. The population was around 4 million. Today we're over 9 million and growing. And so Israel has become the physical center of world Jewry, and I would argue the cultural and spiritual center. So for all of these reasons and more, Israel is indispensable if you value the survival of the Jewish people.
I love that you ended there, because in a lot of academia, that's the terminology. There's this survival school, and then there's this kind of other school, which is the more I think you're referring to. And we talked about that. So I think, look, when we first envisioned this program timing-wise, this was perfect, because it is the confluence of Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut. It's the time when we're thinking about all those things. And you also mentioned liberal Zionism. So you take that idea of the survival of the Jewish people, and you yourself use the phrase, and it's more than that. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Like, what is this mentality? What is this idea that is liberal Zionism in your mind, in your heart?
Liberal Zionism is based on, I would say, two foundations. The first is that Israel is both a Jewish state and a democratic state, and that these two identities are non-negotiable, and that democracy is no less important to Israel's being than its Jewishness, which is to say that democracy is not just a question of a technical matter of how we conduct our politics, but democracy is a profound culture. It's a way of life. It's an orientation and a commitment. And I would call Israel the state of all Jews, or the homeland of all Jews, whether or not they are citizens, and the state of all of its citizens, whether or not they are Jews. In other words, the Jewish state piece of it is that Israel belongs to the whole Jewish people, and not all Jews are citizens of Israel, but Israel still belongs to you in some way as a Jew. And the democratic piece is not all of Israel's citizens are Jewish, but Israel is the state of all of its citizens. So that's the first pillar And this is enshrined in Israel's Declaration of Independence. This is the foundational identity with which we were born. The second, for me, the second pillar of liberal Zionism, again, takes us back to 1945. 1945, the DPs, the survivors living in the displaced persons in Germany and Austria, basically had two Jewish options. There was Zionism in all of its forms, socialist Zionism, right-wing revisionist Zionism, religious Zionism, the plethora of Zionist options, and the overwhelming majority of Holocaust survivors identified with Zionism. But you had a minority in the displaced persons who revived ultra-Orthodoxy. And this was a very small minority, but these were the only two ideologies from pre-Holocaust Europe that survived into the displaced persons. And the reason that I think this is so significant is because each of these ideologies was a very different response to the Holocaust. The ultra-Orthodox response was self-ghettoization. We want nothing to do with the non-Jewish world. The non-Jewish world has done this to us, and our response is to turn our backs to the non-Jewish world. I understand that response. I grew up in a neighborhood in Brooklyn called Borough Park, which was the major center for ultra-Orthodox survivors, mostly from Hungary, but from other parts of Europe as well. So I grew up with that ethos, separatism from the non-Jewish world. The Zionist option, which was adopted by the overwhelming majority of the survivors, was very different. The Zionist option said, yes, after the Holocaust, we need to regroup, we need to turn inward and strengthen ourselves as a people. We need our own country. But that's going to be a basis for rejoining the international community. That's Zionism's vision, was that the Jewish state would not be a ghetto, but would become very much integrated into the family of nations. And these were the two post-Holocaust options. And so for me, liberal Zionism is based, first of all, on Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And secondly, on the Jewish people's re-engagement with humanity. And I'm speaking as the son of a Holocaust survivor. And I grew up very much with the idea that after the Holocaust, it's impossible for the Jewish people to have a normal relationship with the non-Jewish world. But Zionism came along and said, no, we are going to reestablish a healthy relationship with the non-Jewish world. And I think that one of the reasons why American Jewry created this alliance with Israel, because it was based on this shared vision of rejoining the international community, the family of nations, but as a Jewish collective, rejoining as self-identified proud Jews, but not in a ghetto, not through self-ghettoization, but by recreating a more healthy relationship.
Well, it sounds like, as Ephraim said, one of the lenses for this whole series and this program in particular is this exploration of global anti-Semitism, the way people view Israel. And it sounds like you've articulated the group or the groupings that would care more about that survival aspect, and then the group that has this other, maybe larger conception of what Israel is and can be. So where does that leave us in today, in 2021, with Israel, everything that is with the diaspora-Israel relations, politics within Israel and that tension? It sounds like you've laid the groundwork for understanding some of that. I'm not saying you've told us the answers, but how do we look at a couple of those things given what you've just said, both the tension between, again, Israel and diaspora, and Israel's internal politics, which right now for the past 3 years hasn't been able to figure itself out.
David, until now, we've been discussing the good news. Now let's turn to 2021, and there's a lot of very difficult news to unpack. First of all, we are in the 53rd year of Israel as an occupier over another people, with no apparent end in sight. And that has very serious implications for our long-term ability to maintain ourselves as both a Jewish state and a democratic state. And I still believe deeply that a two-state solution is possible. I believe it is essential for us, for our needs. But I don't know how likely that is. And once I would have said it is likely. Now we don't know. We really don't know. I mean, one thing that I've learned from living in Israel is that you can never freeze the frame, and you can never say this is Israel, because Israel is so dynamic, and its situation is so malleable that we really move through radically different realities. I'll give you an example. Last July, many of us, and I certainly include myself in this, were frantically trying to stop Netanyahu from annexing parts of the West Bank. I was doing everything that I could. I was writing op-eds. I was contacting American Jewish leaders. I was trying to do whatever was in my hands to stop Israel from making what I felt would have been a disastrous mistake. 6 or 8 months later, nobody remembers that we almost annexed. And instead of annexation, we have 4 peace treaties with Arab countries. 4 peace treaties that are genuine people-to-people agreements. Our first real agreements of normalization. Because the peace treaties that we have with Egypt and Jordan were really grudging and formal. These are real peace agreements. So the situation is so unpredictable that yes, right now it does not look great for a two-state solution. But who knows what can happen from literally from moment to moment. So I think that that option needs to be very much cultivated. We need to continuously affirm our commitment to a two-state solution, even when it seems unlikely or remote. The second issue that we're dealing with really more immediately is the ongoing electoral crisis in Israel, which basically revolves around one man. This is all about Netanyahu. It's all about his legal problems and his extraordinary ability to hijack the political system. We've now been through 4 rounds, astonishing, 4 rounds of election in 2 years. And we may very well be going to round 5. This is very dangerous for the stability of democracy. It's very dangerous in particular for the morale of the Israeli public, for the credibility of our democratic institutions. We also have a prime minister who has actively declared war against the courts, the media, the police. Now, you in America may not know what that's like to have a political leader who declares war against the democratic institutions and the democratic ethos of your country. But I can tell you it's a very scary period to live through. And I'm actually not going to blame Trump for Netanyahu. I think Netanyahu developed his anti-democratic instincts on his own, but there certainly is some uncanny resemblances that are being played out now in Israel. And so I'm worried. I'm very worried at this particular moment in our history. I'm worried about the future of Israeli democracy. One thing, though, David, that I would really emphasize is that when we speak about Israeli democracy, we need to put it in context. And the context is that it's a miracle. It's a miracle that Israeli democracy exists at all. Because if you think about Israel as a country that was born in war and that has never really known a day of genuine peace, there's no other democracy in history that's experienced what Israel has. And we've absorbed these waves of refugees that we were talking about earlier, the Holocaust survivors, the Mizrahim, the Jews from Arab countries, Soviet Jews, all of whom came from countries that had no democratic traditions. And you bring these traumatized refugees into a pressure cooker, a permanent pressure cooker. And yet we've managed to nurture our democratic institutions and really grow them. And so for all of the anxiety that I feel today for the future of Israeli democracy, it's really important to affirm at the same time that this is.
Completely agree. And let me push you on something. And then full disclosure, I know Ephraim has said it. Some of our other questioners will say it. You know, I've read a lot of your work, done some studying with you. I think I took this idea from you, which is Israel could not be anything in a sense, but what it is. It's the sum of its parts. It's the sum of its immigrant communities. And the fact that it is anything productive is incredible. But I'm going to push you on something you did say in our conversations. Just a second ago, you kind of put this on Netanyahu's shoulders. I'm going to ask you about a word you used, which was status quo. Is it more about Netanyahu or this status quo that is either in people's minds better than alternatives, again, in their minds, and something that people both in the diaspora and in Israel are stuck on? And I think you used a phrase that something in that mentality that makes that okay needs to change for us to move forward, both as a diaspora community and as an Israeli political community. So I'm going to push you a little bit on that. Like, is that more of the problem, and what can be done about it?
So what I struggle with in myself, what I argue with myself about, is at what point is it safe enough to risk a Palestinian state? If you ask me today, do I think a Palestinian state will be a peaceful neighbor for Israel? My answer is no. I don't believe that the Palestinian national movement has made the truly historic shift in consciousness to accepting the legitimacy of a Jewish majority state in any borders. I think the Palestinian national movement, in all of its factions, including Mahmoud Abbas, including Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, to say nothing of Hamas, has not made its peace with our legitimacy. I worry that if we withdraw from the West Bank tomorrow, and when I talk about the West Bank, I'm talking about the next hill from where I'm sitting now. The West Bank is 1,000 meters outside of my porch. I'm looking at the lights of Palestinian villages now. And so is that going to be a peaceful neighbor, or is it going to be another Gaza? If I had to bet on it now, I would say in all likelihood, if we pull out from there, where I'm sitting might be unlivable. It might be the next Sderot, the next French Hill, this neighborhood where I live in, could very well be the next target if that becomes a Palestinian state anytime soon. So, like most Israelis, I am by default a supporter of the status quo. The question is, what kind of status quo? The status quo we have today is an illusion. It's not a status quo because we're continuing to expand settlements deep into the West Bank, outside of the areas we call settlement blocks, where there is a consensus for Israel to keep building. These are areas that are close enough to the old border that we all know they will remain part of Israel, even in the agreement. But we are expanding settlements all over the map. That's not a status quo. That's very much taking strong incremental steps toward a binational state. And so I am for a genuine status quo, which would freeze settlement buildings, certainly outside of the blocks, and at the same time, actively pursue the possibility of a long-term transformation. There isn't going to be peace now. Peace now is an idea that came and went and was destroyed in the Second Intifada, those 4 years of suicide bombings in the early 2000s. Peace now is dead. Many American Jews don't realize it. And that's one of the disconnects between Israelis and American Jews. Almost no Israelis believe that peace now is a realistic approach. And I agree with that. But between accepting the end of peace now and allowing the settlement movement to determine the course of events, there's a big gap. There's a big spectrum there of options. We should be bolstering the Palestinian economy. We should be looking for Palestinian partners. We should be speaking actively with our new Arab partners in the Gulf, in Morocco, Saudi Arabia. How do we move the region closer to a two-state solution together with our new Arab partners? And we're not doing that.
Right. Well, one of the last questions I'm going to ask before we go to some questions from some of our committee and from the Q&A box. And again, if you have some questions for Yossi, we hope to get to a number of them. So please put them in the Q&A, and Ephraim is sifting through them right now. But the question I want to ask is half comment, half question. We wanted you, Yossi Klein Halevi, on this call for this conversation because you're generally thought of as someone who is clearly a Zionist and a supporter of the Zionist project, yet, just like a lot of Israelis inside Israel, you ask some very hard questions of Israel and Israelis and Israeli society and political society. In the United States, we wrestle often, almost daily, with what you can say, what you can't say about Israel. We are wrestling right now with 3 different organizations coming out with definitions of anti-Semitism, largely revolving around what you can say or not say about Israel. So, and just to be clear, that conversation is tearing us apart. It is tearing at our very fabric. And one of my questions for you, and I think some of our other questions, ask what, from your perspective, can we do about that? If you were speaking, which you are, to our US audience, how would you frame what that conversation can be like and how we can have something that is a little more unifying than what is right now very divisive? Not an easy one, I know.
There are red lines that any community needs to establish. The question is, how high is the bar? How high are these red lines? I believe very much in red lines on the Israel conversation, but my red lines are quite minimal. My red lines are, it is not an acceptable part of mainstream Jewish discourse to oppose the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state, as a Jewish majority state. That, to me, if you cross that line, as for example Peter Biden has done, then to my mind you're no longer part of my conversation. What you're telling me, as an Israeli, you're telling me that you don't really care whether I have the ability to defend myself in the most dangerous region on the planet. You are effectively abandoning me to the Middle East. You are abandoning 7 million Jews and 9 million Israeli citizens to the tender mercies of one of the hardest regions, most dangerous regions So I am not prepared to have that conversation with anyone, Jews or non-Jews, about whether I have the right to exist, whether I have the right to defend myself. Beyond that, all issues are on the table and need to be on the table, from the occupation, the place of Arab Israelis in the mainstream, and going back to your question, David, about liberal Zionism, I think that a liberal Zionist agenda needs to really be focused on two issues. One is, how do we move the Palestinian issue away from a binational state, which is, again, the direction we're heading in, toward a long-term vision of a two-state solution. And I emphasize long-term. We're going to need a lot of patience. And the second crucial part of a Zionist vision, a liberal Zionist vision, is integrating Arab Israelis into the mainstream. These are issues where I need American Jewish partners. And I would add a third issue, which is religious pluralism. The Jewish state made a promise to the Jewish people, which is that our public space would reflect the totality of Jewish experience and Jewish identity. Instead, what we did, because of cheap coalition consideration, is we handed the keys to Judaism to one part of the Jewish people, to the ultra-Orthodox, which happens to be the one part of the Jewish people that feels the least sense of responsibility for the totality of Jewish people. And yet we've given them control of Judaism in the modern state of Israel. Now that to me is a tragedy. It's actually an anti-Zionist act to do that. And so these are some of the issues for a liberal Zionist agenda. And I need partners in the American Jewish community. I need partners for this fight. And it's a long-term fight. I need partners who are determined and have a great deal of patience and a great deal of love for Israel. And I also need partners who understand something about Israeli reality. Because Israel is very different. We work very differently than the United States. It's a totally different society, different culture. And I need American Jews to enter Israeli reality in the same way that I need Israelis to begin taking American Jewry seriously. These are the two centers of Jewish life that are basically left after thousands of years of history. We are 90% of the Jewish people either lives in the state of Israel or in North America. And what that means is the future of the Jewish people depends on our relationship. That places an enormous responsibility on us to treat each other as serious partners, as equals. And it's not a one-way street. Israel has responsibilities to American Jewry. The first responsibility is to respect American Jewry in all its diversity and to listen to American Jews. But I also need American Jews to understand the complexity of Israel.
I think that last comment you made is incredibly opportune, because that really is what it's about. And from the Federation perspective, the JCRC perspective, we very often try to say exactly what you just said: understand Israel and its complexities, and Israelis need to at least appreciate somehow and understand what happens in the United States. So I'm going to pause my questions there. Ephraim, thank you for joining us, my partner in crime here. I know Ephraim has one question he's been kind of been burning and wanting to ask. We have one more person we're going to bring on live, and then we'll have some remaining questions answered from the box. Go ahead, Ephraim.
Great. This has been fabulous, Yossi. Thanks so much. So I've heard you talk about this before, but there is no conversation in Israel between the right and the left. I've heard you say it's basically between the right and the center. What happened to the left? Where is the left?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point for American Jews to internalize, because the way that the Israeli debate plays out in the American Jewish community is still very much right versus left. And in Israel, the left has been almost completely marginalized. The Labor Party has made a little bit of a comeback. It got 7 seats in the last election. Meretz, I think, got 7 seats or 6 seats. These are the two left-wing Zionist parties. But 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 15 years ago, the Israeli left was a credible opposition. It had a large part of the Knesset, and it has nearly disappeared. And the short answer is Yasser Arafat. When the Labor Party threw in its lot in the 1990s, the Oslo process, with Arafat, it took an enormous gamble, and it risked its reputation on the credibility of peace with Arafat. And Arafat betrayed the peace process, and to my mind was never a serious partner for peace, never intended to peace. And one of the many casualties of Arafat's betrayal was the Israeli left. The Israeli left, during those terrible years of suicide bombings, the Israeli left lost its credibility, it lost its standing in Israeli society, and most of the left moved to the center. And the center is a very interesting place. The center is certainly where I position myself. The center basically says, we're for a Palestinian state, but we don't believe that a Palestinian state is possible anytime soon. The position that I laid out to you earlier, not peace now, peace maybe later. That's the centrist position. The right-wing position is peace is impossible. There's nobody to talk to. There never will be peace with the Palestinians. That's not my position. But my position at the same time is not what I consider to be a naive left-wing wishful thinking of peace.
Thank you. I'm actually now going to bring on a special guest. This is Rabbi Hal Shevitz, who is actually the chair of our Rabbinic Council, who will ask a next question, which I think is a good one.
Great,
thank
Rabbi.
you.
Thank you. As David said, my name is Hal Shevitz. I'm Rabbi of Congregation or Atid here in Richmond, and as David said, chair of the Richmond Council of Congregational Rabbis. And if you'd permit me,
it's a great name for a shul.
Or Atid, yes, thank you.
I've never heard that before. That's an original.
There's only like 2 of them in the United States, yeah.
Right.
So if you would permit me actually for a moment to be, I'm not sure what the term would be, fanboy, groupie of yours. During rabbinical school, I spent the school year 2010 through 11 in Israel, and first heard you speak when I participated in the weekly Hartman Rabbinic Seminar.
True.
Yeah. And what resonated with me so much was your proud and unapologetic Zionism, coupled with your ability to speak with such nuance and really hold the center. And I've since seen you speak many times at APEC conferences and at Hebrew College, my alma mater. And I've read your books, and I'm a regular listener to your weekly podcasts with Daniel Hartman and Alana Stein-Hayes. Yeah. And I find those podcasts enlightening and challenging and entertaining. And so it's a real honor to meet you, even virtually, and to engage with you on this topic.
Pleasure to meet you.
So fanboy moment over. So as someone who is regularly engaged with Amcha, right, the people, specifically American Jews, I have a tachlis, practical question. So I'm a Zionist, and yet that term means many things to many people. And as I'm sure you know, there's a hesitancy among many American Jews to talk about Israel because our definitions of Zionism and our dreams for the best Israel it can be are very different. And then, of course, politics plays a role because wherever we sit on the political spectrum, whatever side we're on, that might dictate how we talk and think about Israel. Or we just don't talk about Israel at all, precisely because it will rouse those divisions that when we want to keep things peaceful and harmonious. So my question is, what advice can you impart to me as an American rabbi, to those of us American Jews who are those lay leaders who are listening, and to the members of our community who care about and love Israel, to engage about Israel and who want to hold the center? How can we speak with nuance about Israel in our community?
I really appreciate the question. The first thing I would say is that an Israel-based conversation needs to begin with love. And your job as a Jewish leader is to convey something of your love for Israel to your congregants. And beyond the politics, we start there. We start, the ground is love. And love is difficult to convey. You know, it's a very personal emotion, and yet at the same time, it's certainly love for Israel is something that is shared by enough Jews so that there really is it isn't only a personal. In terms of cultivating a relationship with Israel, I think we need to move beyond a politics-based Israel conversation. And that's really where it is now. And it doesn't matter whether it's AIPAC or J Street, I mean, it does matter. It matters to me. I'm much more in the AIPAC camp. But it doesn't matter in terms of developing a richer relationship with Israel, where you stand politically, because if your relationship to Israel is only about Israel's problems, which is really what the political conversation is about, either Israel's needs or Israel's inadequacies or Israel's flaws, if that's the conversation, then we're missing the vitality, we're missing the experience of Israel. So one of the things that I've been doing at Hartman over the last years is teaching popular Israeli music to groups of rabbis and Jewish leaders who come to the Institute. And that's something that that's just one example. There's so much vitality in Israeli culture. We are creating Jewish culture. It isn't only Israeli culture. It used to be an earlier iteration of Israeli culture, when Israeli culture was very secular and very Israel focused. We didn't really have a shared language with the diaspora. Israeli culture today is much more Jewish. Jewish prayer is part of Israeli music. Jewish themes, Jewish history. Israelis are much more Jewish than they were a generation. So there really is an opportunity for deeper relationships. So those are some of the ideas. In terms of a nuanced conversation on politics, what I would say is the Hartman approach to an Israel conversation, shifting it from an argument over political differences to a conversation over shared values. And if I can give you an example of how that would work. Let's say, let's take the Palestinian issue. It seems to me that there are three basic issues related to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The first is security, the second is justice, and the third is peace. Now, if you were to ask most Israelis, what do you consider to be the most important of those three in this conflict? Overwhelmingly, we will tell you security. Ask American Jews, especially younger American Jews, what's the most important of those three issues? I think they'll be divided. Some will say security, some may say justice, some may say peace. Now, when you have that kind of conversation, the next question is, okay, my number one priority is security, your number one priority is justice. But are you opposed to my security? Do you favor Israeli security? Well, yes, of course. It's just not my number one commitment, it's my second commitment. And then you can ask me, well, okay, security is your number one commitment, but are you as an Israeli opposed to justice? And I'll say, of course not. as soon as my security is guaranteed, then yes, of course, let's look for a just solution. And so what begins as an irreconcilable debate between left and right turns into a much more nuanced conversation of shared values with different orders of priority. And that's legitimate. We all have different orders of priority, but we also do have a shared Jewish values conversation. And if we can really keep focused on that, then I think we could really help diffuse a lot of the unnecessary tensions within the American
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm going to try to synthesize. We got a number of questions, Yossi, during the registration process, and one of them popped up here as well, too. Thanks for hanging in there, everybody. Our intention was to go to about 3:15. We're obviously even going to slide a little bit past that, so thanks for hanging in there with us. But I think the correct number is that Mahmoud Abbas is in his 17th year of his 4-year term, but there are purportedly going to be elections. So is there a leader? Is there somebody out there who can move things forward towards the direction of peace? What's your feeling on that?
You know, I'm asking myself that same question, but not about the Palestinians. I'm asking it about us. Do we have anybody out there who can step in and save the day? Right now, I don't see it. I don't see it on our side, and I certainly don't see it on the Palestinian side. You know, one of the main disappointments of Palestinian politics is that they reduce their options to either a corrupt Fatah or a fanatical Hamas. Those are their two options. And you ask yourself, where's the Palestinian middle class in all of this? Why isn't there, at the very least, a third option? A party that's for normalization with Israel, that's for a genuine two-state solution, that's for compromise. Where is that voice? And so I know that there are Palestinians out there who want that. And I know that because I meet with people, I encounter them, but they have not yet organized into a force. And so I don't know. At this point, at this particular political moment in the history of the Israelis and the Palestinians, neither side is doing particularly well with leadership.
Thank you. David, did you want to ask a final follow-up question, or do I want to give Yossi the opportunity, since it is 3:15?
Let's do that. I think that's the best way to go. I will just say, especially the last question that Rabbi Hal asked, and I thank him for asking it, Yossi, was spot on, because I asked you a question about how we have less division in our conversation about Israel, and I love the way you phrased it. I hope we can work further on that, which is we all have priority values, but just because your priority is different from mine doesn't make you the enemy. It just means yours is one and not two, or however that works. But we need that so badly here, and I appreciate you for saying it. I appreciate Rabbi Hal for asking the question, and I even think that one you just asked Ephraim was very important in the way you spun it, Yossi, which is, okay, let's ask both sides. Where is the next leader coming from? So I will just say I appreciate all your insight from today, and if you want to have a few last words before Ephraim wraps, please do.
Well, this is a very powerful week in Israel. In fact, we're really going through these last 2 weeks what we call in Israel the modern Israeli version of the high holidays. It begins with Holocaust Memorial Day with Yom HaShoah last week. It moves tomorrow night will be Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day for the fallen soldiers. And then we go to Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. And there's something very powerful about this movement of the Israeli calendar. You know, beginning with Holocaust Memorial Day, we mourn the consequences of powerlessness. Then we go to Yom HaZikaron for the soldiers, and we mourn the consequences of power. We mourn the price we paid for the renewal of our power. And then we celebrate. We finish our days of mourning, and we go into unequivocal celebration. And Israeli Independence Day, for those of you who've never experienced it in Israel, is an extraordinary day because it's not extraordinary. It's a very kind of normal day. It is, to my mind, the happiest day on the Israeli calendar. It is the day, I know for me, it's the day when I am most relaxed. I feel completely at peace, and I feel this great joy. And it doesn't come from any event in particular. I don't really do anything on Independence Day. We'll barbecue some tempeh, that's what we'll do these days. And listen to some Israeli music, get together with friends, which is now possible in Israel post-corona. And so there's something it brings us back full circle to how we began this conversation, which is gratitude, the word gratitude. And I think that if we reorient our relationship to Israel and begin from that place of gratitude, everything else is doable. How we manage our internal arguments, how we define anti-Semitism, how we deal with BDS, all of the problems, and they're serious problems, they're really serious problems. The occupation, the place of Arab Israelis in Israeli society, the absence of religious pluralism, these are really serious issues. But if we begin from that place of Dayenu, the very fact that we're here and we celebrate Independence Day with the price that we've paid, then I think that that's really going to carry us forward. And you know, I really am an optimist. I really believe that or you know, maybe optimism is the wrong word. I have hope. I have a great deal of hope. And I don't think Israelis are optimists, but Israelis are among the most hopeful people in the world. And so I'm delighted to have shared this conversation with the two of you, and very grateful to you for bringing me in. I know we both have worked very hard to make this happen. And thank you. And I hope someday we can do this in person.
Absolutely. Thank you for those uplifting comments today. Thank you for your time and your insights and your perspectives, Yossi. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you. So on behalf of the Jewish Community Federation of Richmond and the Jewish Community Relations Council, I'd like to thank everybody for attending today's conversation with Yossi Klein Halevi. Again, thanks to our sponsors, Allianz, Secours, Salomon and Ludwin, and Dominion Payroll, and of course, thanks to our community partners. I'd also like to thank the staff and leadership of the Jewish Federation and all the Federation supporters who make programs like this possible. And please join us on the 25th of April for our last virtual tour of Israel, which will be an exploration of Jerusalem from an interfaith perspective. Thank you for everybody. Appreciate your patience at the beginning. We had a little bit of a rough start, but I think I told you it would be worth the wait and worth your time. Thanks to everybody. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you all.
And good evening, Yossi.
Good evening.